So tonight we are joined by Michael McKernan, and the topic for tonight is When Things Fall Apart. So a quick summary: in this time of confusion, anxiety, and social upheaval, both personal and collective, how does our spiritual practice support us? Michael is a psychotherapist with a background in psychology and clinical social work, and his spiritual work points to a lifelong inquiry into a heartfelt sense of greater connectedness and belonging. His early spiritual life was formed in the catechisms of the Catholic Church and seriously pursued the priesthood before he met his wife of 48 years. And in those years has welcomed 3 children and 4 grandchildren. As a psychotherapist, he spent over 45 years in many clinical settings learning about himself and how people cope with crisis and how to move beyond fear and reactivity to greater freedom and love. So with that, welcome. Thank you, Michael, for being here.
Thank you. Good. I would like to stand when I'm talking, so I hope that's okay with folks. And I've got a fair bit of material here, don't be worried. It's just my way of making sure that I stay focused and helpful. So first of all, I think it's a really great thing to be able to appreciate the presence of a spiritual community. Jack Kornfield talks about spiritual friends. If you're familiar with Jack Kornfield down in Spirit Rock, outside of San Francisco, that sense of we really do need community to support us on our journey that is bigger than any one of us can manage alone. So I'm very respectful and appreciative of your community. I think enough has been said with regards to my background. I'll emphasize that I truly do enjoy and value the work I do. I don't have to work in the sense of financial things, but I absolutely have to work because this is how I feel alive, is working with and sharing the process of coming to life for people. My bias is always to assume that when people come through the door, that they're at the edge of an opportunity for growth. A long time ago, I was taught to think about psychology or psychotherapy as a business of diagnosing illness or psychopathology. I've since dropped that behind in favor of recognizing this is a person who has come to the edge of something very important, and the growth opportunity is available. How can I help? It makes it a lot easier for me as a therapist to be thinking about growth than about what's wrong. And so my process of working with people is very much one of looking for how can this be your opportunity to learn. And that'll probably show up in how I talk tonight. As you can see, I'm going to be reading, so that isn't too distracting. I'm going to be talking largely in a sense of likely stories. I don't think that I've got the truth. I don't think we have the truth. And I'm not even interested in having the truth. But I am interested in how we explore together what it is that seems to be true, not merely about this body and this mind, but this experience and the field of possibility that we might refer to as spirituality. I might also add that for all my professional training and professional experience, I'd have to say that being married for 48 years has been this really challenging learning ground for me. I don't know if I consciously did this, but I chose a wife who doesn't put up with bullshit. And that was a challenge for me. I realized that learning how to negotiate love is stuff that I had to learn along the way. I didn't come complete with that sort of knowledge. And I think it goes back into families and so forth, generations upon generations. We're all looking to learn better how to love. And that's me too. Likely stories is a notion that it's the best explanation I have for what seems to be true. It may change, okay? There'll probably be gaps in my presentation, things that perhaps I haven't touched on, and I certainly welcome you. I think there's a question period at the end, and I'll welcome that from you. so that we can make sure that we're talking about what matters to you. Now, this is a bit of an auspicious time because while we're together this evening, we'll have the precise moment of the winter solstice. And while it's perhaps an astronomical event of mild interest for folks, it links us back through thousands of years of recognition of the significance of the winter solstice as being a time of the passage from darkness to light. The sun that went down today is dead, has passed away. The sun that rises tomorrow is the newborn sun. And you can see the correspondence to the language of Christmas. There is a correspondence. On my wall at my office, I have a picture of a burial mound in Ireland that's 5,000 years old and has a passageway, a very narrow passageway to the very center of the tomb. And for 50 minutes on December the 21st, it will shine to the very heart. In other words, the sun of resurrection. So it has a powerful significance. And 8/27 this evening is when we officially mark it. But I think of it as the spread of what leads up to this point of death and resurrection and what follows. It's a transformational time. And I think of that as a pretty good metaphor for what I was talking about tonight. So we're kind of talking about perhaps taking the opportunity to acknowledge 8/27 when it happens. So transformation, as I'm sure you know, can come in the form of beauty, of positive experiences, birth of a child, and a magnificent experience in nature, an experience of love, any number of positive ways that can bring us to a place where we feel like our life is different. Something happened for us as a result. I'm here to talk about the ways in which, when life falls apart, is a transformational opportunity. That would be my focus, but I don't want to ignore the fact that transformation happens in a lot of different ways. Perhaps the one that's most troubling and deserves some careful interpretation is the times when things fall apart. How can this possibly be okay? How could God possibly permit this sort of stuff? It's a way of recognizing that it deserves a kind of interpretation, I guess, a kind of recognition. So when we talk about this business of transformation, one of the things that I think is true is none of us escapes the experience of life falling apart. We can talk about it in the form of life falling apart as a result of a traumatic incident, and we can talk about it as something that sneaks into us quietly, a sudden sense of doubting one's marriage, one's career, one's sense of life or lovableness that weighs down heavily upon us and puts us into a place of darkness. Sort of like Isaiah, when we talk about the solstice, that sense of the people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. There's a transition. Walking in darkness is not unfamiliar. Am I assuming that correctly, that there's nobody here that has yet to have a falling apart experience of some kind or another? I suspect not. Just wanted to check. There's a lot of ways in which we experience this falling apart. We can, a loss of energy. It could be anxiety. It could be numbness. It could be confusion. It could be falling into addiction. There's a lot of different ways that we can experience that in its darkest forms. It's important to appreciate that in our culture, we live in a culture that suggests that suffering is some kind of a mistake. If you were living the right kind of life, this wouldn't be happening to you. And I think sometimes we bring that home against ourselves. But it does amount to the fact that when people do suffer, sometimes there's a feeling of shame or guilt that comes with they didn't achieve the good life. They don't manifest the standards of good life. Somehow they haven't fit in well. And this may lead to a kind of isolation or a double life, a sense of things I must hide. If you really knew me, you couldn't love me, that kind of feeling. So we know that there's a lot of ways in which we struggle to find our way, and sometimes how we struggle, it brings on more suffering. We go into debt. We struggle with expectations that leave us feeling not good enough. We covet, we hide, we hate our weakness. There's a lot of ways in which this can be a kind of a journey downwards because of, I guess, the context and what we've learned to believe about having to be a certain kind of person, a certain kind of success, a certain kind of okayness. Hans Selye, who is a world-renowned researcher into the field of stress and distress. Someone want to answer the door?
Don't worry about it.
Yeah, it's strange. He said that perhaps one of the most stressful things that human beings can experience is trying to be somebody else, not able to be with ourselves. Julian of Norwich, if you're familiar with Julian, she's a 14th century Rhineland mystic, one of the really remarkable women from another era that headed a monastery that included men and women. She says this: if there be anywhere on earth a lover of God who was kept safe, I know nothing of it. It was not shown to me. This was shown, that in falling and rising again, we're always kept in the same gracious love. Pema Chodron, leader of a monastery out in Cape Breton Island, says this. She says, to be alive, to be fully human and completely awake is to be continually thrown out of the nest. You get that? That sense. To live fully is to always be in no man's land. To experience each moment as completely new and fresh. To live is to be willing to die over and over again. I don't know if that's a language that's very common in the way we talk about it in our culture, but it's a very sophisticated way of appreciating that we're constantly having to find our way back to what seems okay within us or around us. From the awakened point of view, that's life. Death is wanting to hold on to what you have and to make every experience confirm you and congratulate you and make you feel completely together. And even though we say Yamamara is fear of death, it's actually fear of life. That's a very Buddhist perspective, and one that resonates powerfully, but it really asks us to take up a courageous perspective on things that happen, things that throw us out of the nest. Having said that, the goal of spiritual practice, as I see it, is not to escape pain, but, however imperfectly, can we sustain openness and willingness in the face of the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, to quote Mr. Hamlet. Sometimes this becomes a time of struggle that our persistence or good fortune can help us to find our way through. Sometimes life falls apart in ways that will never be the same. A death, a loss of a marriage, a terminal diagnosis. In this case, it may be enough just to find our way back from rage or despair or loneliness. Again, this is the mechanisms of spiritual journey, is not around it, not away from it, but through it. This is life. We keep wondering why it has to be this way, and maybe we'll find out someday, but in the meantime, this is it. Richard Rohr says, all great spirituality is about what we do with our pain. He says if we do not transform our pain, we transmit it in some form. Does that make sense? We either claim responsibility for our experience, or we are projecting it, we're putting it out as blame, we're withdrawing from it, we're punishing. We're doing a lot of things that take us away. He says that all initiation is not so much about being a warrior as much as it is about being alive, alert, and awake. He says, take this as an absolute. If we do not learn this all-important lesson, at least one and maybe all of the following will happen. We will become inflexible, blaming, petty as we grow older. We will need other people to hate in order to expel our inner negativity. We will play the victim as some form of a means of false power. We will spend much of our lifetime seeking security and status as a cover-up for a lack of a substantial sense of self. And finally, he says, we will pass our deadness on to our family, our children, our friends. Heavy stuff, but a fairly kind of blunt recognition that we're either doing our work, we're either finding our way of reckoning with life falling apart, or we're making someone else carry the burden of our distress. And I see that all the time in the work that I do. Often generations deep pain, people, parents or grandparents who were in the death camps, people who have lost a parent in traumatic ways, or a grandparent that died traumatically, or abuse that's happened, often shows up in the lives of people where it didn't happen to them, but the weight of it does. And I think that's Richard Rohr's observation. So how do we arise? How do we find a way of moving through what we think of as life falling apart experiences? And sometimes, of course, that's a me falling apart experience. You can kind of get that sometimes when we call life falling apart, it's not meeting our expectations, and so it's falling apart. It's not doing it the way we think it should be. We've already told God the way it should be, and it's fallen apart. What's wrong? But how do we do it? Well, of course we need some kind of a path, and we need some sort of a community of teachers that maybe goes back thousands of years, a lineage, a community of people such as this. We need some kind of a vision, and from my point of view, dynamic psychology, which I think is kind of more vital and less rigid. Dynamic psychology and spiritual practice offer vital pathways, and for some, spirituality and psychology are opposites. I've certainly experienced that in my field, where I've had feedback when I've given presentations of this sort, that they really don't belong together, and it's kind of unprofessional. I think it's becoming less, but I still see that to be the case. In my experience, there isn't a separation, there's just a division of labor, as far as I see it. They're kind of complementary sources of support. Psychology really addresses itself to the personality, the ego, the life circumstances, the way of managing life. Pretty important stuff. In fact, without the ability to address our life and our issues, our spiritual life will often be contaminated by fear or by practices that are aimed at trying to escape ourselves and our life experience rather than growing into and through our life experience. Spirituality promises a vision of reality beyond personality and ego, to address the mysteries of life before birth, after death, but also the time between. It speaks of values of love, the transcendent reality, and that it's all contained in this world, but more. My sense is that spirituality without psychological awareness can become rigid and rule-bound living and become a kind of spiritual bypass. A spiritual bypass meaning I'm employing spirituality to escape from my life, not to deal with my life, not to be in my life. Psychology without spirituality is too restrictive and doesn't honor our intuitive truths, our intuitive recognitions about the life forces within us and the experience of what it is that makes it possible for us to address questions like life and death and what happens after death. I've had my own experiences recently, and I'm still working on them. I've lost a father 2 years ago and a grandson 2 years ago, and that's still that's a life falling apart and a kind of a life journey into learning about what it means to be without the floor, without the space. In fact, at one time in my life, when I was dealing with another kind of issue with my daughter, who had been diagnosed with a life-threatening cancer at age 6, I was sitting with a spiritual community at the time, but it just dawned on me, all my life I've been thinking I was walking on a field, solid ground wherever I put my foot. And suddenly I realized I was walking on the edge of a cliff. And that, to me, is the kind of thing that I think Pima children will speak to us. Yeah, that's the way it is. So, how does life falling apart stir us into growth? Well, for one thing, it brings us compassion for others who know the suffering that we're feeling. It opens our heart to the experiences of others that perhaps we couldn't possibly know without having been there ourselves. It causes even the most guarded of us, the most private of us, to seek help, to ask for help in a way that perhaps desperation is the only reason I'm doing this or taking this kind of risk, but it opens you to a world of dialogue or healing that perhaps would never be available without the desperation. It awakens the potential to be a healer of what you've gone through. This is very much a feature of shamanic traditions where the initiation of a shaman includes a visionary experience of descending into hell and to be feasted upon by various carrion birds, each of which has a name of an affliction. And whatever birds have feasted upon you, have torn you apart, they are empowering you to be a healer of that affliction. The resurrection, the taken apart and the coming back together again, the death and the life is an initiation process that often we see in more traditional cultures. It's been watered down a lot in our culture, like in the Catholic Church. There used to be, like when I had a confirmation, the bishop would come with his mitre and give you a tap on the cheek, Well, in older cultures, it might be a broken tooth, or it might be sent into the woods naked to survive for a week. Something much more rigorous that really convinces you of the power of being on the edge of life and the initiation into another stage of life. I think that life falling apart, or me falling apart, requires a higher level of consciousness to call us beyond the puny sense of isolation and limitation and fear that we might call ego, that can possess us and take us. It can ironically, it can become a kind of an experience of suffering or loss or devastation that can break the shell of reactive or narcissistic living and can open us to a freedom of spirit-centered living. I think it also helps us to sharpen our reality and our priorities when we're struck with something very powerful that makes life not the same anymore. The way we can identify and recognize some of the things that are most precious that we will give everything for. Things that perhaps we haven't been as conscious of as suddenly, bang, we're clearly there. And secondly, at times when we can recognize that some of the things that we've given a lot of our life energy to actually don't matter a heck of a lot. And suddenly that becomes very clear. Now, let me talk about a case that I work with just as a way of kind of illustrating, and then I'll give a little exercise to kind of, again, address this question about, being in this place of life falling apart. Mary is a client of mine that I knew a number of years back. Initially, I saw her and her family because of concerns for their daughter. The session went surprisingly smoothly. I didn't think there was a great deal of concern for the daughter. And so I gave some encouragement and some direction and so forth, and we left off at that. The daughter was a lovely kid. I wasn't concerned for her at all. And I was even wondering why was I seeing this? Because it didn't seem like that difficult situation. But a couple of weeks later, the husband came and talked to me and said, would you be willing to see my wife? She's suicidal. She's lived a powerfully painful life and so forth and so on. And what I learned from her was growing up in Europe, she actually had suffered cult abuse, very severe abuse. Well, the most severe abuse I think I've ever witnessed with a client, and I've certainly had plenty of stories to listen to about that. And one of the things that was very clear is how difficult it was for me to even believe that this happened to this person. And yet the consistency of her stories and further information I got later that confirmed it truly was this bad. There were 6 children involved in this cult abuse. 4 of them committed suicide. 1 was still alive, and Mary herself had attempted suicide a number of times. So a really dramatic and very powerful example of life falling apart that we can't, that we wouldn't wish on our worst enemy. She was very addicted to alcohol. And during the time that I worked with her, there was a number of suicide attempts that included hospitalization and so forth, and dehospitalization. So it was a rough and difficult road. But our work together, which I consider to be a great privilege, because this is a woman who was profoundly frightened of facing the story that she was carrying inside of her, yet the story that was carrying inside of her, she was fighting with as a demon all her life. And so her courage, I admired profoundly. And as we worked together, her progress was a greater and greater capacity to actually listen to herself, to feel herself, and to be with herself. And in the process, learn to process her experiences not so reactively by trying to run away from it through suicide or alcohol, but rather to acknowledge the pain that she was carrying and to have compassion for that very young girl who went through what she went through. Over the years, and it was years of work, more often she was able to work with her reactions to painful triggers and to gain confidence and freedom to be able to go back into her professional career, which she had to leave because of too much strife. So it was a journey that was closer and closer to being with herself, being able to be present and acknowledging herself, and then to take action on her own behalf that is so different than the attempts to get away from herself. Such as through alcoholism, through obsessive compulsive behavior, through suicide attempts and that kind of thing. Another example can be working with men, where it's very common for me to be sitting with a couple, for example. I do a lot of work with sexual betrayal, where a couple will come in, life has fallen apart for them. What the wife thought that she had wasn't true. It was a shock, it was a devastation, and where do we go? Very powerful stuff. And in the process of working with this, I'll sometimes find that the man has difficulty being able to tolerate his wife's pain, or the willingness to actually acknowledge over and over again what really happened for her. And so anger sometimes shows up as a defense. And my recognition is that our way of trying to escape pain sometimes causes a great deal of suffering, and in this case, working with men to help them to kind of see past their anger to the vulnerable part of them that they're protecting with their anger becomes an opportunity, not only for him to connect to a more authentic self, but for his partner to hear and see him in a more vulnerable state. And I've seen this often, that when I'm sitting with a couple and the husband has had an opportunity, I will engage the husband and move towards a more vulnerable conversation. I will see the partner move from turned away and kind of leaning away from her husband, turning towards and leaning towards a kind of message of, in your vulnerability, in your honesty, I can be with you. This is safer ground. We can talk. So this is kind of the gist of what I'm talking about in finding my way. Now, I'll do a little exercise, and I'll be just to invite you to kind of check in with your own sense of how this is true for you, how your stories or your experience matters, and how you connect. So if you can identify a time where life falling apart is what you would say happened to you at that time, I'm asking you to choose one that's kind of moderate to small, not the big ones, because we want you to kind of focus on the process rather than on the experience, right? So, not the biggest, just a moderate one. And when you think about that time, you think about that experience, despite all that happened, here you are. What do you recognize that sustained you through the those times. It may be a person, it may be a sense of grace, it may be an angel, it may be a pet, it may be a happenstance. First of all, is there room to look at what sustained you with an attitude of appreciation, an attitude of gratitude? Secondly, can you tell the difference between what you did at the time of the experience, what your reaction was, and what you felt? Again, we're noticing the difference between what we do about it, what we feel, and the feeling. And just check in with what it was like for you. Can you check in with, what did it feel like in your body? Perhaps memories or beliefs that arise, a sense of worthiness or goodness or not. Can you look at your experience through the eyes of compassion, empathy, appreciation for that you, maybe a few years younger than you, maybe a lot of years younger than you? Can you recognize what you needed most that perhaps you can offer to this younger you now? An acknowledgement, appreciation for, wow, that was hard. I feel for you. So, how was that? This way of looking at oneself, looking at life falling apart. Thank yourself for your moment of connection and compassion that you bring. Some of you, of course, I appreciate it, don't feel that you want to or don't feel ready for that kind of thing, but there may be another occasion when that would be a useful opportunity for you to explore. Being with yourself. Here's some observations. First of all, I've always found it intriguing to realize how often our behavior and our choices trigger a crisis that forces us to grow. In other words, we're kind of hoisted by our own petard, as they say. We put ourselves in a position to have to learn something. And I find that over and over again quite fascinating, the way in which the secret affair or the thing I was doing that was wrong, I slipped up and I accidentally left my computer open, or I accidentally told somebody that told somebody. I somehow perpetrated an experience of crisis for me, where I had to reckon with something and I had to grow. I'm very familiar with working with addictions in various kinds, and one of the things that I will sometimes experience, not all the time, but people who've been doing the work for a while, they will say, as strange as it seems, I'm grateful for the addiction. It forced me to learn and grow in a way I never would have. That's a powerful transformational perspective on the experience of life. In all of this, there's no question that it calls for a lot of courage and sometimes a lot of desperation to be willing to step into this kind of work and find a way. Sometimes it's a matter of grace. Sometimes we just know that it could have gone awful. I could have had an accident there when I fell asleep at the wheel, but I didn't. Those kinds of thoughts. And sometimes, one by the name of James Hillman, a psychologist in the Jungian tradition, he says, how do you know that there's guardian angels? The fact that you're alive. The fact that when you think back on all the things that have happened in your life, here you are. So, what do we mean by spiritual practice? I'm going to simplify it by borrowing again on Jack Cornfield. Spiritual practice is what you're doing right now. Whatever it is. To what extent, whatever you're doing, if it's the dishes, if it's sitting in a lecture, if it's driving a car, if it's having a conversation, how present are you? How compassionate, how available? If you're sitting by yourself, how present, how available, how conscious, how loving? You don't need to be in a church, you don't need to employ religious language, but spiritual practice is what you're doing right now. Sometimes spiritual spiritual practice is just the willingness to get up again. There's a saying, Chinese say, fall down 9 times, get up 10. I think that's a very real path to healing. It's never a straight line, and so I invite people when I'm working with them to appreciate that in their journey, what they're working with is going to be an up and down time, and your job is to keep getting up again and again, until eventually you stand at the rock and in the place. Paul Rumi, he says, come back, come back. No matter if you've sinned 1,000 times, come back. That's the deal. I say it's easier to give up the idea of a perfect relationship or a perfect way of being as a person, and more to develop a very good strategy for repair. A willingness to come back to the conversation, a willingness to acknowledge, to apologize, a willingness to be vulnerable. Sometimes it begins by just being willing to get up a bit. Sometimes spiritual journey, the journey through a time of life falling apart, you could be doing very well, and it still looks pretty messy. It takes some degree of compassionate awareness to appreciate that people in desperate circumstances will do things in a way that doesn't look great, and yet you watch the courage that's implicit in how they're handling things, how they keep coming back. And so I do think that it's very important that we find a way of appreciating things that we're doing. It's so easy in difficult times to find ourselves falling into a kind of list of the things wrong or bad or difficult about my life, or about this. Is it possible to turn your attention to what you can be grateful for, what you've done today, even if it's something small? That's your beginning to see the light. Walking through the darkness, you begin to see the light, and you begin to entertain the idea that there's some goodness in all of us today, no matter how unhappy or how much of a struggle it is. Getting a growth perspective may take a while. This isn't a 7 steps to weight loss kind of model. Eat everything you want, and lose 25 pounds in 2 weeks, or whatever it is. And we really can't promise that this is some kind of easy fix. It's just that the journey, however long, is a worthy one. And sometimes we need to be encouraged to know that there's nothing weird about you suffering grief for a lost partner or a lost parent 2 years after the fact. That's what we call simple grief. Complex grief can go on a lot longer, and it's real and understandable. And more often than not, I think it helps people to know that their experience, what they're doing and feeling, makes sense. To reassure them that they're entirely human. So, a few comments about specific things and with a color. Okay. Still with me? I know it's a heavy topic. What? Talk a bit louder? Okay. I'll try. So, if falling apart is kind of like a fire, then psycho-spiritual practice is like a fire drill. It prepares us for the time when we'll really need to pull it together, when we'll really need to know how to put one foot in front of the other. So what are some of these examples? Well, I think of a Buddhist practice in Tibet Buddhism. They suggest that we practice dying every day. That's a weird practice and something that probably is counterintuitive. But it leads us into, first of all, an honest reckoning with the impermanence of life. And then secondly, it awakens an incredible appreciation for the experience of being alive, and how precious it is to be alive. And I certainly have my own experiences of visiting hospitals, and I have clients who have died or are dying at the present time, and you just really, really see, you know, how precious life is, and how great an opportunity it is for you to recognize what a precious thing it is to be this life, to have this gift of life. Larry Dawsey, doctor from Texas, talks about the power of prayer, but he talks about it from a perspective of research that says, effectively, in brief, that people who are prayed for will heal faster than people who aren't. And there's been very controlled studies that people all the way around the world who were given simply a name, no information about this person, but one group would pray for this person, and a control group that wasn't prayed for. And they found measurable differences in recovery time. It may not be dramatic, but it's significant. The power of prayer, Tonglen in the Buddhist tradition, the awakening of conscious and intentional connection to another, to a higher power, to God, to whatever we envision as being an expression of the flow of the universe. Turning towards that can awaken us to the sense we're not alone, not without a sense of being connected to something much bigger. Power of prayer can be a tremendous gift. And sometimes that's the only thing we can do for someone that we love who's suffering. It may not be available to us, they may be rejecting, they may have a hard time accepting anything, but you can pray for them. And it does something that work for you as well as that. I can tell stories, but I'm mindful of time, so move on. I really encourage people, and I think probably there was one variation into daily practice, some kind of a meditation practice, some kind of attention to your physical health, sometimes some attention to your emotional health, your psychological health, your spiritual health. What is that for you? But doing something small every day to acknowledge and prepare yourself for the day, to remind yourself that you are, as Taiyao Bishop Dan says, you are a spiritual being having a human experience. Remind yourself of that. It's very easy to get caught up in the world, so we want to create some balance by reminding ourselves we are spiritual beings alive to this wonderful gift of life. We talk about the role of forgiveness. And forgiveness, in my books, begins with you forgiving you. That's the journey. Some of you may be familiar with the Hawaiian tradition of Ho'oponopono, which is a practice of forgiveness that is initially focused on you, on your sense of, I failed to do what I should have done, I let myself down, I let my partner down, I was not as willing as I should have been. You know, whatever it is, let it go and practice letting it go. Put it down. You're going nowhere if you're carrying the weight of self-recrimination and negativity. If you can do that for you, you can practice doing it for others in your relationships. It's a very powerful practice because too often we end up carrying a load of regret or distance or hostility. Couples that have been divorced 25 years ago who still can't be in the same church for their daughter's wedding. Wow, what a loss of energy and loss of life opportunity. Practice awe. Practice seeing the world is a magnificent place, a miracle. If you've ever read Bill Bryson's book on the body, or any other book that really talks about the miraculous process of a physical being, millions of processes that have to happen every second for us to be here doing what we do. It's a miracle. It's awesome. Spiritual teachers from back then, and I'm lacking the name, but back in the 12th century, I believe, a Jewish teacher said, spirituality begins with awe. The awe of witnessing death, the awe of the birth of a child, the awe that takes us out of any kind of comprehensible sense of things and knowing we are witnessing something amazing. so much bigger than can be understood. Peace that passes all understanding. And finally, imagine that we're answering a calling in this life to enjoy the ineffable privilege of being alive. Just imagine that that's part of our job, to experience, as Joe Campbell would call it, the rapture of being alive. I'm not struggling to try and find meaning or purpose behind these devastating things, because maybe there isn't one that we can ever grasp, but the journey to find the rapture of being alive, that to me is a very powerful call. So I'm going to read you a poem, and I have 100 poems I'd like to read you, but I'm going to just read one, because you probably would fall asleep if I got to get it. But there's so many lovely ways in which poets speak to this in a way that psychologists and philosophers and therapists can't or don't have it. So I'm going to give you one. This is Find Me Off Dead Center by Ted Logan. It says this: "O persistent God, deliver me from assuming your mercy is gentle. Pressure me that I may grow more human, not through the lessening of my struggles, but through the expansion of them that will undam me and unbury my gifts. Deepen my heart until I share it with and myself openly and my needs honestly. Sharpen my fears until I name them and release the power I have locked in them, they in me. Accentuate my confusion until I shed those grandiose expectations that divert me from the small, glad gifts of the now and the here and the me. Expose my shame where it shivers, crouch behind curtains of propriety, until I laugh at last through my common frailties and failures. Laugh my way towards becoming whole. Deliver me from just going through the motions and wasting everything I have, which is today, a chance, a choice, my creativity, your call. O persistent God, let how much it all matters pry me off dead center, so that I am moved inside to tears, or sighs, or screams, or smiles, or dreams. They will be real, and I will be in touch with who I am, and who you are, and who my brothers and sisters are. Thank you.
Oh, 8 o'clock.
How does that go for timing? Is
That's
that
perfect.
Oh,
Yeah,
good.
we can have some time for some questions. With you? Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Thanks, you're welcome.
Thank you.
It's a privilege, it really is, to share.
Yeah, I feel that, and I feel all your experience and all your presence and the intention with which you share and how heartfelt that is, and I'm sure the rest of you are the same, so thank you. Is there any questions from you that you want to maybe like Michael to discuss more, or is there anything?
If you don't ask questions, I'll read you more poems.
I have a thought just to get the discussion going. You know, when we think about transformation, it can have this, feels like a big word and it feels significant. You know, like even when we talk the change from, you know, darkness into light, it's very significant. Can you maybe speak to, I think, you know, when we're going through these challenging times that, you know, may be devastating, those big leaps, you know, of transformation coming through that can seem far away. So can you maybe talk a little bit about how the smaller transformations like can help us as we move through the times? Because how can we look to that for our own well-being during those times?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question because, yeah, it's easy, perhaps in the way I was talking, to suggest that we're really looking for some kind of a big slam dunk kind of conquering of disaster or something. And really, it's more the day-to-day, being with yourself. There's very small victories when you stay in a conversation that has made you nervous. When you meet sadness without flinching, perhaps you even share it and invite someone to talk about it. It's the small gestures that accumulate as a matter of lifestyle, as a matter of habit, that I think have the most power to give us strength. And often, my experience with in psychotherapy is not that one session and bang, some incredible insight and it's all over. It's more like little by little. There's moments when suddenly you can look back and say, well, there are some differences for me now. I'm seeing something different, and I feel like that's probably a more realistic picture of what transformation is. We look at the dramatic examples because they're easier to recognize and perhaps easier to celebrate, and perhaps they're the ones that we want. We would love to be able to have a meditation experience where we lift off the mat. We would love to hit nirvana. Like you hear, I've heard of people talk about this. My first meditation experience, and I was in a transcendent realm. Well, most of us don't have that. Most of us have the job of doing 10,000 hours before we can expect anything dramatic. So it's worth really appreciating that. I think transformation is small works done every day, and the ability to appreciate our progress, the ability to acknowledge our work.
Yes. When I heard you quote Richard Rohr,
Oh yeah.
and there was this comment around, how we maybe are responding during times of crisis, and then you were mentioning, or maybe it was his words, but that substantial sense of self.
Yeah.
I was struck by that. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about what that would mean? Like when we look at what is a substantial sense of self?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Let me think.
It's just interesting to explore.
Yeah, it is. I think I view it as a sense of deep connection and self-acceptance that allows us to trust ourselves so much that even if other people don't see us or don't agree with us, we can still stand with ourselves in a way that maybe frees us up from having to prove something or escape. So it's usually, and Richard Rohr will talk about this, he'll say, the only people I find really credible are the people who have died before they die. People who have gone through stuff and they really have reckoned with something serious. And in that process, have come to a deeper recognition of who they are. Sort of like the Ted Loder poem, that, if I do this work of really committing to being with myself, of allowing myself to feel what I feel, allowing myself to be open to share with others, that I develop a stronger sense of connection. And the word self kind of can be a bit tricky because it has multiple definitions, but a stronger sense of self begins, I think, in psychological development as a more substantial sense of ego. I'm becoming somebody. And then in the second half of life, it's becoming nobody. It's sort of a Ram Dass kind of phrase. It's a way of recognizing that capital S self is not so much a definitive sense of me as much as it is a connection to a more expansive awareness that this life energy that flows through me is connected to a much larger thing. And as many teachers will say, we spend an awful lot of time trying to substantiate ourselves in small ways, trying to reinforce the continuity and the solidity of ego, that when we acquire a capacity to be more open and perhaps free from the limitations of having to be somebody, we can experience a stronger sense of relatedness and belonging that we might call a substantial sense of capital S self, which is not so much defined as a me factor as much as I'm belonging to something very big. And I think that's the inspiration that a lot of spiritual teachers will talk about as something that supports them to endure very difficult times. I remember a cartoon that it shows a yogi sitting on what appears to be a mountain cliff, and he's got one of those headphones with a speaker and everything, and he says he's on obviously a phone talking to somebody who's having a difficult time, and he says, have you tried turning yourself off and then turning yourself back on again?
Exactly. Does anyone have any questions or need to bring some discussion?
This remark you made intrigued me. I'm not sure I understood it when you said in a study, supposedly a peer-reviewed scientific study,
Yeah.
showing clearly, and probably must have been
Significantly, yeah.
Significantly,
Yeah.
that anonymous people praying in some undefined, so
Yeah.
what that meant, to an anonymous person for some reason not yet found, actually had a beneficial effect on the well-being of the person.
Recovery rate, yeah.
Now, you've got concepts of self that you've just been talking about. What is self and where does it extend, and what is it? And there's some ideas that self is more than just what's in the head or part of the way, but a community as well.
Yeah.
So it makes sense to me that there may obviously be ways in which, if you were sick and everyone here is wishing you or praying in that term, something, and you knew about it, it may make a difference. What, as a clinician with a scientific background as well, what is your explanation for what you just said when, is this UFOs or is this, what's the chi or the energy, or where is this stuff that allows such a communication and a physical manifestation to be transmitted and to have a result?
Mm-hmm.
And that's I'm trying to get my head around that, if I understood you correctly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't know. I can speculate. I think that in the theories of stages of consciousness, we do arrive at a level of consciousness that links us to all life, and we are a part of all life. And that's a state of consciousness that is, that sometimes we can experience briefly. But the suggestion is that we have the power to tap into that with intention, and whether we understand exactly what the mechanism is or not, we can experience significant difference, statistically significant difference. So it's not like when I got out of the bed and walked away after surgery, it was more like it was a notable change in the rate of recovery. So there's many stories that talk about this. There's a lot of research. There's very, very, very interesting research in parapsychology, research into near-death experiences, research into cases of reincarnation that are substantiated, that certainly awaken us to the realization there's a great deal more at play here than the small agendas and the kind of separate, independent kind of sense of self that we tend to live with and believe about. And so these people who are doing this research are asking us to think, in a bigger way, somewhat like mushrooms, that sense of the interconnectedness that exists throughout the forest. The sense that people will talk about, the butterfly flapping its wings creates the hurricane, the other side of the world. How we explain that, I don't know, But it seems to be an intuitively appealing way of looking at it. And I will sometimes explore that with people in terms of, have you thought about praying for this person and what it would mean for you? And could you imagine the energy of your intention and caring has some significance for them? Perhaps someone who's died. You know? Having spent a lot of time exploring the literature, I hear about people who are pretty convinced and who report on the experience that it was very significant. I felt someone praying for me. I felt it made a difference. That's about all I can go with. I can tell you some pretty wild and crazy stories, but if we stick with more conventional scientific analysis, we're still looking at how interesting it is that energetically we can be so connected. Quantum physics brings us into a field where, like Bell's theorem, where a particle halfway across the universe changes the spin immediately, instantly, faster than the speed of light. The change is happening with a particle in another side of the space. How do we understand that? But it's something that's been established enough to say there's a theorem that says this is so. It asks us to be expanding our imagination about what's really true and what we're really capable of.
Yes. Damn, that was good.
Which one?
Yeah. Each morning I wake up. The calamity is still there. It is still as sharp and painful as it was yesterday morning. And I make this small, incremental improvement in the way that I embrace my circumstances. And I think that, sort of paraphrasing what you said, that my ability to accept, embrace, and perhaps even overcome this calamity, this set of circumstances that have shattered my world. And today I made a small incremental movement up the side of the sand trap. But it wasn't enough to actually get to the rim. And tomorrow morning, I find myself at the bottom of the sand trap. So how do we square the idea that the source of the pain, loss, shattered, cannot conceive, with the idea of those small, tiny, incremental improvements in the way that we can perceive and accept that?
So I'm gonna.
There was a question in there.
Yeah. I was taken with the description and so forth. Maybe you could just phrase the question again so I can make sure I understand.
Yes, the calamity, the circumstances, the loss, the set of circumstances that have shattered my world are just as powerful, just as intrusive this morning as yesterday morning. And yesterday, with your help, I made a very small incremental movement up the side of the sand trap. But when I wake this morning, the calamity is no less painful, and that small incremental improvement has been swallowed. How do I square the idea of incremental improvement against a vast bottomless pit of despair.
It's a good question. It reminds me of the myth of Sisyphus, that pushing that rock up the hill and it rolls back down again. Um, I think that, first of all, recognizing incremental improvement, however you measure that, acknowledging it is a kind of placing it in memory that makes it less possible to forget, more likely to remember again, more likely to reaccess it in another way. I think that the ingredients of dealing with the valley of the shadow of death, if we were to use that metaphor, involves a community. Like, one can't do this stuff alone. We can't think our way out of dark places on our own. And so we do need the opportunity to speak, which has its own power to open us up. When we speak instead of just think, it changes our experience of what we're dealing with. Overcoming a tendency, just seeking out community becomes a valuable thing, such as what you're doing. I think that there's also a way in which we say, okay, nobody knows what your journey is supposed to be like. Nobody knows how this is supposed to work. And perhaps we can all kind of get the sense of sometimes being in a dark hole. But I do believe that setting up a program of behaviors, of ideas about how I will live, what my intentions are, becomes a big factor in how I settle, what settles emotionally for me in my life. Being concerned about other people, paying attention to others who are suffering and giving support to them can lift our own burden significantly in the sense of isolation or that feeling of being in the bottom of a hole all alone. So when I'm working with people, I will suggest to them, there's a certain kind of way of identifying a specific set of behaviors that they recognize are things that are doing that are signs of me not doing so well. And I ask them to pay attention to that each day. At the end of the day, just how many of those behaviors, usually 7, and then identify a list of behaviors that are things I know that when I'm doing this, I'm creating something positive for myself. How many of those happen today? And in this way, gaining a bit of a rigor for self-awareness and for momentum around this. And there's no promise that it's going to take you all the way out of the hole, but there's a belief that there's room for healing. Now, there's a lot of other things that we talk about, but that would be a few suggestions in that ballpark.
Momentum. Thank you so much.
Sure. How are we doing for
I
time?
was just gonna say, Michael, it's 8:20.
Oh
So
my
it's
God.
fine,
So what do we do now?
So would you like to give us a summary of 3 key things that we should take away with us tonight in summary? And then I think we'll pause because we're gonna come into 8:27.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. You know how I want to do that? I want to read another poem
Oh, I
that summarizes it,
love
if that's
that.
okay.
Sure.
Does anybody know Mary Oliver?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Do you know Wild Geese?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Read it.
It's a lovely poem, isn't it? I have a book of hers, of collected poetry, and between clients, I'll read a poem. And you join her in her wanderings and her reflecting. And she always has a cute little twist about how she can capture something. Well, Wild Geese has always been a favorite, so I'm going to read that. Okay? You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk for 100 miles on your knees repenting. You only have to love the soft animal of your body loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I'll tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, wild geese high in the clean blue air are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over again, announcing your place in the family of things. There's 3 things in there.
So it is 8:22.
Santa Claus is coming.
Exactly, but we like to come into silent meditation at
Wonderful.
8:27. I will take the tinctures, the bells, and just ding them. It was like 3 times, seems right. 3 times, just quietly to let you know it's 8:27. And then, Michael, when you feel it's appropriate, you can bring some. Okay.
Here we can bear witness to an event that truly it can pass by very quickly without notice, but its symbolic significance, symbol is something transparent to a more infinite truth. We're witness to death and birth in an instant or in a lifetime. When you wake up tomorrow morning and look at the sun, say hello, welcome to the new sun. And what you hold inside of you is the experience of a new birth, a new life possibility. And how will that influence the way you live your day?
Michael. It was a beautiful reminder tonight for me in the spirit of solstice that, you know, we are the balance of the light, and yet we can also welcome the darkness, that both are here and both are true, and that we are here having this spiritual experience in our human body. And thank you for bringing us back to that.
Yeah.
Help us all remember and connect to that in ways that are teaching us.
My pleasure. This is my big day. Christmas isn't the big day. Today is the big day for me. And I tell a lot of people about it, maybe to the point of boring them, but it's a very exciting thing for me.
With gratitude.